The last door in the Luxembourg Maze. It began with a whisper, a rumor that drifted through the corridors of Europe's financial world like a draft from an unseen chamber. Luxembourg, a nation known for its quiet precision and airtight discretion, had built a labyrinth of institutions admired for their stability. But behind that smooth facade lay a final door, one few had ever questioned, one even fewer understood. And when it finally creaked open, it revealed a truth that reshaped the continent's idea of security. To understand how a hidden vulnerability formed in one of Europe's most carefully constructed financial systems, we must return to a time when Luxembourg's rise felt almost effortless. The country became a sanctuary for capital, structured, shielded, and expertly managed. Its laws welcomed foreign investors. Its regulators balanced transparency with discretion. And its banks, trusts, and clearing systems intertwined to create a machine so polished it seemed immune to the flaws that plague larger nations. At the heart of this machine stood an institution whose reputation bordered on myth. It managed cross-border flows with near-perfect accuracy, serving governments, corporations, and private wealth from every corner of Europe. To the outside world, it appeared invincible. Inside, however, early anomalies flickered, small delays in reconciliation, inconsistencies in reporting, whispers of mismatches between internal and external records. Each discrepancy was minor, easy to dismiss, easy to hide, but together they formed a map of something deeper. The first signs came to those closest to the ledgers. Analysts noticed transactions routed through structures that did not match established procedures. Risk officers flagged exposures that appeared out of proportion to declared operations. And regulators, during routine inspections, encountered answers that felt too polished, too rehearsed. Luxembourg's system depended on absolute clarity. These anomalies hinted at shadows forming along the edges of its perfect symmetry. Still, the institution's stature muted concern. After all, Luxembourg had weathered storms that shook larger nations. Why would this time be different? Confidence wrapped itself around the anomalies like ivy on stone. But beneath that ivy, cracks had begun to spread, cracks that pointed toward a hidden room in the financial maze, a room no one had dared to open. Those who monitored the system sensed what was coming. A door long kept closed would soon reveal what lay behind it. And when it opened, the maze would never look the same again. The deeper investigators probed, the more the anomalies began to converge into a pattern. What had first appeared as clerical inconsistencies now formed a chain of irregular transactions threaded through subsidiaries, partner institutions, and offshore entities whose ownership structures dissolved the moment anyone tried to trace them. The institution's outward elegance masked an inner architecture that had grown far more complex than its founders ever intended. Inside the Luxembourg system, senior analysts exchanged uneasy glances over balance sheets that no longer aligned with historical behavior. Cash flows fluctuated without clear cause. Certain high-value clients moved funds through channels that bypassed standard verification steps. On paper, everything remained pristine. In practice, the numbers carried a weight that hinted at pressure building behind closed doors. Some staff raised concerns. Others urged silence, fearful that drawing attention to the discrepancies might disrupt a system that relied on confidence above all else. Meanwhile, external partners began to sense something amiss. A major European bank requested clarification on several cross-border settlements that arrived with timestamps slightly out of sequence. Another institution flagged a mismatch between declared assets and exposure limits. These inquiries were subtle, discreet, the kind that circulate quietly among compliance teams. Yet each one added tension to a structure already strained at its seams. Luxembourg's financial heart was designed to beat evenly. Now its rhythm stuttered. Inside the institution, executives held closed-door meetings late into the night. They reviewed reports that suggested certain portfolios carried risks far greater than previously acknowledged. Investments tied to foreign markets showed unexplained variations. Instruments once considered stable had been revalued using assumptions that grew less defensible with every passing week. Some leaders insisted the system was sound, that the inconsistencies were temporary, technical, harmless. Others recognized the warning signs for what they were, the early contours of a problem sophisticated enough to hide in plain sight. Pressure mounted as auditors uncovered structured vehicles buried deep within the institution's network, entities that transferred assets back and forth in loops designed to obscure their true value. These mechanisms, once legitimate tools for efficiency, had evolved into convoluted arrangements no single department fully understood. The maze, once admired for its elegance, now revealed corridors that twisted into darkness. Regulators felt the shift as well. Reports submitted for routine review showed subtle signs of narrative smoothing, risks minimized, exposures framed optimistically, footnotes layered with reassurances. Nothing overtly fraudulent. Nothing easily challenged. Yet the tone itself signaled danger. Regulators began asking sharper questions, requesting deeper documentation. The institution responded politely, but with delays that grew harder to ignore. Outside Luxembourg, rumors began circulating among Europe's financial observers. Analysts noticed odd patterns in regional clearing data. Traders remarked on tightening liquidity in sectors historically linked to Luxembourg's institutions. A few suggested, quietly, that a hidden imbalance might be forming. None had proof. All had intuition. And as these whispers spread, those within the institution confronted a reality they could no longer soften with polished reports or carefully worded statements. The anomalies were not isolated. They were symptoms of a system whose complexity had outrun its controls. The maze had grown too intricate. And somewhere inside it, a fault line was widening, one that would soon force the last door open. The first rupture emerged in the quiet hours before dawn, when a senior auditor, normally composed, methodical, unshakable, hurried into an internal review meeting with a stack of documents that seemed to hum with urgency. The numbers he carried did not merely hint at imbalance. They revealed a cavity at the core of the institution's operations, a hidden deficit that had been obscured through years of layered transfers, optimistic valuations, and a confidence so strong it had muted every earlier warning. The maze was no longer metaphor. It was real, and the door at its center had finally swung open. The revelation rippled through the institution with silent force. Analysts cross-checked the auditor's findings and found patterns they had missed: asset loops designed to keep valuations inflated, internal trades booked as external exposures, and reconciliation gaps that widened the further back one traced them. What had once been explained as timing delays or harmless technicalities now revealed intent, not necessarily malicious, but certainly desperate. Somewhere along the years of growth, adjustments meant to smooth volatility had quietly morphed into mechanisms that masked fragility. Executives convened immediately. The boardroom felt colder than usual, the polished wood absorbing the tension rather than reflecting it. Charts projected onto the wall displayed the truth in brutal clarity. The institution's risk position was far more precarious than its public filings suggested. Some exposures were nearly impossible to unwind without triggering shockwaves across its network of partners. Others depended on asset valuations that no longer held under scrutiny. A few senior leaders stared at the data in disbelief. Others closed their eyes, already familiar with the implications. Beyond the institution's walls, the contradictions began to surface as well. A European partner flagged an unfulfilled settlement that should have cleared days earlier. Another institution noted an unexpected delay in receiving confirmation for a routine transfer. These events, seemingly minor, were enough for perceptive observers to sense that something inside Luxembourg's financial machine had slipped out of alignment. Word spread quietly across trading desks: something was wrong. Meanwhile, regulators intensified their inquiries. Requests for documentation grew more pointed. Follow-up emails arrived faster. Meetings once cordial took on a sharper tone. They sensed resistance, subtle but unmistakable. The more questions they asked, the more carefully constructed the replies became. And behind each polished response lay a gap, an omission, or a silence that suggested the institution was struggling to keep its carefully balanced narrative intact. Inside the institution, morale shifted. Employees who had once taken pride in the precision of their work now moved through hallways with expressions clouded by doubt. Informal conversations ended abruptly when supervisors approached. Junior analysts whispered about the discrepancies they had noticed months earlier but never pursued aggressively. Senior officers weighed their loyalties against their responsibilities. The sense of unity that had defined the institution began to fray. Then came the turning point. A valuation model used to price a major category of assets collapsed under regulatory review. Its assumptions, long considered conservative, proved deeply flawed when exposed to real-time stress testing. The assets were worth far less than reported, and the difference was large enough to breach capital thresholds that had never before been in question. The institution's strength, once treated as a given, now depended on numbers that could not withstand scrutiny. Outside, markets reacted instantly. Liquidity tightened around entities known to rely on Luxembourg's clearing infrastructure. Analysts issued cryptic notes suggesting investors monitor developments closely. Several funds quietly reduced their exposure. Nothing had been announced publicly, yet the financial world could smell the shift, subtle, sharp, undeniable. Inside Luxembourg, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved: the institution could no longer contain the problem behind layers of complexity or polished confidence. The maze had reached its limit. The final door had opened, and what lay behind it demanded action, swift, decisive, and unavoidable. And as the night gave way to dawn, the question that had lingered for months now took shape with terrifying clarity: could the institution survive the reckoning that was coming, or would the fault line at its center pull the entire system into its collapse? The reckoning arrived with a clarity that left no space for denial. As the final reports were circulated among Luxembourg's senior regulators and the institution's top executives, the scale of the crisis stood in full view: capital buffers overstated, exposures tangled across jurisdictions, and valuation gaps so large they could not be bridged by accounting finesse or hopeful projections. The last door in the maze had opened, and behind it lay a void no one could ignore. The government convened an emergency session before sunrise. Ministers listened as regulators detailed the institution's condition with measured gravity. If left unaddressed, the failure could send shockwaves across Europe. Luxembourg's financial ecosystem, small in geography but vast in influence, was woven into funds, banks, and clearing systems across the continent. Even a partial collapse risked triggering liquidity shortages in markets unprepared for sudden stress. The nation that built its reputation on stability now faced the possibility of becoming the epicenter of a continental crisis. The debate that followed was fierce. Some officials argued for immediate disclosure, insisting that transparency was the only way to preserve long-term trust. Others warned that announcing the full scope of the problem would provoke panic before safeguards could be put in place. The room oscillated between principle and pragmatism, between clarity and caution. But as projections darkened with each passing minute, one reality became impossible to escape: intervention was unavoidable. A plan was drafted with quiet precision. The state would take temporary control of the institution, stabilize its critical functions, and guarantee essential operations to prevent contagion. A restructuring authority would unwind the most toxic assets, isolate compromised portfolios, and tighten oversight mechanisms that had grown too lenient over years of expansion. It would not be clean. It would not be painless. But it would prevent collapse and reassure the financial world that Luxembourg still commanded its own stability. When the announcement reached the public, the reaction was swift and stunned. Headlines spread across Europe, describing a crisis few had imagined possible within one of the continent's most disciplined financial hubs. Investors watched closely. Markets wavered, then steadied as the government's guarantees took hold. Luxembourg's citizens, a community accustomed to quiet confidence, absorbed the news with a mixture of disbelief and resolve. Inside the institution, teams worked around the clock. Transfers were monitored line by line. Portfolios were audited with ruthless precision. Corridors once hushed with routine now buzzed with urgency. And yet, amid the pressure, a sense of clarity emerged. The maze had been exposed. The unseen corridors mapped. The vulnerabilities acknowledged. What had once been concealed through layers of complexity was now being rewritten with transparency. The broader lesson resonated far beyond Luxembourg's borders. European regulators strengthened cross-border supervision. Banks recalibrated their exposure to complex vehicles. Funds demanded greater disclosure. The crisis became a catalyst, forcing institutions to confront the dangerous allure of systems that grow too intricate to fully understand. In time, Luxembourg rebuilt what had fractured. Not by restoring the maze exactly as it had been, but by redesigning it with clearer lines, stricter rules, and an awareness of how easily confidence can turn to complacency. The last door had opened, and instead of breaking the system, it illuminated the path forward. Every financial world carries hidden rooms, structures so familiar they escape scrutiny. Luxembourg's story is a reminder that strength is not defined by secrecy or complexity, but by the courage to confront weaknesses before they spread beyond control. Subscribe to join the journey.